Thank you so much. Happy Palm Sunday to those who are celebrating that. And I am certainly celebrating, among many other things, the fact that we have as our special spiritual guest today someone that I admire to the moon and back, Wayne Hsiung. If you are an animal protectionist, you know Wayne, you know him by reputation. He is an attorney. He founded Direct Action Everywhere. He is now heading up and is general counsel for simpleheart.org. He is known for his work in open rescue, and he has actually been one of those brave activists who was willing to go to prison for the work that he did on behalf of animals. Now, we are interfaith, interspiritual, and interspecies, and this section is the interfaith portion. So we try to bring people who represent all different sorts of religions and spiritual beliefs. And I've never even talked with Wayne about that. I do not know if he believes in God. I just know that he is doing God's work. Welcome, Wayne Shug.
It's great to be here. It's been
Oh, it's
fun having
so wonderful to
conversations with you
have you.
guys in this space.
The coolest thing about, well, you have many cool things about you, but when I met you the first time, met you via Zoom, or maybe it was telephone back then when you were on my podcast the first time, I knew you were serious. I knew you were smart, and I knew you were as dedicated as could be. I didn't know how much fun you would be. So, really the whole package. Don't know if you're single or not, but I'm just putting all that out there. So, Wayne, for people who are not very familiar with your work, can you give us a brief explanation of how you got to be you?
Yeah, I'll explain it in three very simple stories. The first is a story of me going back to China for the first time, and I think it was 1989, and seeing a dog at a market who looked exactly like my dog at home, who was being prepared for slaughter. And it was the first time in my life I realized there are things about the systems in which we live that are not just wrong, but profoundly, nightmarishly wrong. And I fell on the ground, grabbed my dad's leg, started crying, and begged him to do something about it. And he said to me, "This is just what they're taught here." And I realized then that there's some things that we're being taught that are wrong. Fast forward about 30 years, and I'm walking to a slaughterhouse for the first time as a young professor at Northwestern School of Law, failing as a professor, realizing I am not going to get a tenure track position, which had been my only goal in life up to that point. It was the only thing I thought my life was meant to be, and I was failing at it. So I decided, well, there's this animal thing. I've been talking about veganism now for most of the last 5, 10 years of my life. I've never seen the inside of a slaughterhouse. So I walked into the last remaining mammalian slaughterhouse in the city of Chicago, thinking to myself, I will try to see this for the first time with my own eyes and maybe even try to give aid to an animal if there's a sick, dying, or injured animal inside the slaughterhouse. And much to my surprise, it was shockingly easy to get in. And I think within the first, it might have been the first visit, it might have been the second visit, even when I was caught in the facility, because I didn't walk in with consent. I just walked into the livestock pens outside of Chipetti Veal and Lamb, tried to take a look, tried to see what I could see, what I could do to help. And when a worker caught me, they just kind of looked at me, nodded, and walked off. And I realized these are big, powerful systems, but at the same time, we can actually pierce that veil. We can walk across these boundaries that most people think cannot be crossed. And even though on that day I didn't save an animal, because much to my surprise, the little lambs and the little veal calves at the slaughterhouse were in fact multi-100 pound animals. It turns out a veal calf at slaughter weight is typically 400 pounds, and a lamb at slaughter weight is 140 pounds. So these little creatures that I thought I could carry out the way I'd carry out a puppy or a kitten were too large for one human being to carry. Um, and then I'll fast forward again about 10 years from 2007 to 2017 when I launched what Direct Action Everywhere called the Open Rescue Network, which is a network of activists training, supporting, and legally defending one another in efforts to rescue animals from factory farms, slaughterhouses, and labs. And so for the last 10 years, that has been my primary focus in life as a lawyer, as an activist. I've been prosecuted now about a dozen times. We've won most of the cases. We've lost two, one of which led to a felony conviction, but no time in jail, and one of which about a year and a half ago led me to be sentenced to 90 days in prison, uh, of which I served 37 days. And frankly, it was 37 of the easiest days of my life because I had a huge amount of time to meditate, to read, and almost shockingly, synchronized was the fact that the judge sentenced me to 90 days. I served 37 days, and it was foreign action in which 500 activists walked into a factory farm and saved 37 hens from an egg farm. So that's kind of what I've been up to the last 10 years, and I'd love to share more about our efforts to try and save animals from factory farms and tell their stories of the world.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so that we can hear you tell these stories, could you get a little bit closer to your mic?
Yes, is this
Bill is
better?
telling me. Okay, thank you so much.
Mhm.
So, animal rights has been around by that name for about 50 years, and a lot of people are doing a lot of things. But what you're doing is more hands-on. It's more direct. So, where did that idea come from, and how do you feel that your approach differs from a lot of people who are also trying to do good work in this world?
I was inspired by a otherwise nondescript, seemingly ordinary grandmother in Australia, who is an American actually, who moved to Australia in her younger years, named Patty Mark. And Patty was an animal advocate, but like me, when I was a law professor in the mid to late 2000s, never saw herself as a particularly radical or even brave person. But when she found out there were hens collapsed and being thrown away in the litter, the essentially the dead pile, the compost of an egg farm, who were just basically slowly wasting away and dying. And the employees were so concerned about this, they tried to report to the company management and to even to government officials that these animals are being left to starve to death. When she learned this was happening and that no one was helping these employees, she just walked in herself and started taking them out. And I always thought this is such a powerful and inspiring individual example of activism because it is our greatest dream when we see these animals suffering, and all of us have seen the photos and the videos. The thing that we want more than anything else, the thing that we know these animals want is to be rescued. You know, they don't want to suffer. They don't want to be trapped. They don't want to be scared. And here's this woman who is showing with her own hands, our own bodies, our own actions, we could change the life of an individual animal and use those stories to change the world because it turns out open rescue, since Patty brought it to the United States, and I believe it was the late 1990s, has been crucial to so much of the development of a farm animal movement in the United States. So many people don't know this, but the original team at Compassion Over Killing, Josh Balk, Paul Shapiro, Miyun Park, started doing open rescues, got in the Washington Post with that work, and then launched the farm animal team at the Humane Society of the United States. Mercy for Animals, which everyone knows now because of the incredible work that Milo has done over many years and that Leah continues to do. They got started doing open rescues in Ohio. And so much of the attention around farm animals is triggered by people taking this incredibly powerful form of nonviolent direct action and then using those stories to provoke a broader cultural awareness about what happens to animals. I think the main thing that makes our efforts different over the last 10 years is the effort to scale. So what Milo, then Nathan did, what Miyun did, what Patty did, all incredibly powerful stories and dramatic examples of the power we all have individually to transform the life of at least an individual animal. But what is even more transformative, not for one individual animal, but potentially for billions of animals, is when you can create movements and networks of direct action. And that's what great movements have done over the last 100 years, whether it's Susan B. Anthony deciding to vote, being tried for it, criminally convicted of it in the late 19th century, the civil rights movement, so many examples from the lunch counter sit-ins, the 1960s, to Rosa Parks in the 1950s, of people seeing the world broken in some way and deciding that the way to change the world is just to be the change you want to see in the world. And most recently with gay rights, where there's so many gay rights activists who are terrified about the prospect of even just saying who they were, being open, even with their loved ones, their family members, about some basic element of who they were and what they believed, the person they loved. And in the 1980s and 90s, there was an incredibly inspiring and courageous movement that inspired so many Americans to come out of a closet and say, "This is who I am," and it's not wrong. And I think what the social scientific research shows on this is direct action is incredibly powerful, even on an individual level. You have examples like Rosa Parks deciding to sit on that bus seat and refusing to leave when the bus driver told her she had to leave just because of the color of her skin. But what really creates systemic change is when it's not just one individual, but when that one individual lights a spark that triggers a mass movement. And the mass movement doesn't actually have to be that large. I mean, the most common figure cited within social scientific literature and research is 3.5%. And there's literally a rule called the Rule 3.5%, pioneered by a Harvard political scientist named Erica Chenoweth. And the rule is this, that every movement in history that has been able to achieve 3.5% of the population in sustained nonviolent direct action. And those two words are both very important. It has to be sustained, so it can't be just a flash in the pan. You go out and do one march and you're done. Also has to be nonviolent. And nonviolence does not just mean our actions, it also means our words. We have to have love in our words and our rhetoric. And that's one of the things that King did so beautifully and Gandhi did so beautifully. But if you're able to do that, essentially every movement has succeeded when it's reached that minimum threshold of 3.5%. I think Eric Chenoweth has now found two movements where that was not true. But out of an exhaustive, probably the most exhaustive empirical study of social movements in social scientific history, hundreds and hundreds of cases, she was only able to find two that exceeded 3.5% of the population of a community and did not succeed. So I think the big thing that we are trying to do that's different is mobilize not just one or two people, or not just traditional NGOs, you know, Mercy for Animals and HSUS and Compassion Over Killing, now Animal Outlook, all do extraordinary work, but they're primarily run by paid staff. What the civil rights movement did, what the gay rights movement did, was they were able to inspire hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who were not paid staff, who were just volunteers who believed in a vision of a kinder world to get out there and sacrifice something themselves too. And that's when change happened.
That's pretty powerful stuff. And you personally have changed so many minds. And I've read that in these cases, not just yours, but others that actually go before juries, sometimes the jurors come out being animal activists. Do you have any stories about that?
Yeah, I was actually just hanging out with one of them. Probably the most surprising animal activist that I have recruited in my life. Lynn is a architectural engineer. I think his background is industrial engineering, and he works with architecture firms. He actually started his own architecture company in southern Utah. He is, by his own description, conservative. He's in Utah, a Mormon state. He was raised Mormon, is now not as religiously connected to the Mormon church, but certainly culturally, you know, very much identifies with the Church of Latter-day Saints. Has never been involved in activism his entire life. He is in his 60s now, retired, has grandkids, and he was called for jury service. And he told me on day one of the trial, when the judge described the facts of the case, just a very brief summary. When the prosecution gave its opening statement, his response is, "This is a waste of time. These people are clearly guilty. What are we here for? We don't even need a jury for this case because they clearly broke into the farm. They stole some property. They're going to go to jail." And in fact, the company at issue, Smithfield, which essentially controls the entire county because 1 in 4 employees of the entire county work for Smithfield, was apparently going to demand 5 years in prison for me. And I have no doubt the judge would have given them 5 years. So, but something pretty miraculous happened when we went to trial. Immediately after hearing me speak for the first time, Lynn said, "Wait, there's something more about the story that I haven't been told by the prosecution. And frankly, I haven't been told by even society as a whole about what happens to these animals and who these animals are." And I described to Lynn and the other jurors my experience of seeing Lily collapse on the floor of the factory farm. I described to them some of the evidence, not just from us, but even from the factory farm itself, that they had 2 million pounds of dead piglets they were throwing into a landfill next door every single year of just piglets. That close to 20% of the piglets were not even making out alive because they had been selectively breeding these mothers to give birth to so many piglets. And their bodies are breaking down from so many pregnancies that 20% of the piglets, which means hundreds of thousands of piglets every single year, were dying from starvation or being crushed to death. And then when I showed them the actual images, and I wasn't allowed to show much of the cruelty footage from this factory farm. And there was one hilarious incident where we had a photograph we wanted to show the jurors of one of the piglets, Lizzie. And Lizzie had just facial abrasions all over her face. She was starving to death, was about 1/3 the size of the piglets. She was covered in blood because the teat from which she was nursing have been essentially shredded from the wear and tear on this mother's body. This poor piglet had claimed was no longer producing milk and had been shredded to almost like a vampire octopus. And when we tried to show this image, the judge actually literally forced us to cut out Lily from the image. So they couldn't see the background. They couldn't see the mother pigs. They couldn't see the damage and the abuse to all the mothers. All you could see is Lizzie, you know? So it was like a little cutout of a piglet that we literally handed to the jurors. And the reason was because the judge thought it would be too prejudicial to show the jurors the cruelty of farrowing and gestation crates. The fact that mother pigs are trapped in these 2 foot by 7 foot farrowing or gestation crates where a 600-pound mother pig will live her entire life. But notwithstanding all of that, even just hearing about this one piglet, and the judge had to allow us to present evidence of at least the one piglet, because after all, we were being accused of stealing this piglet. If we couldn't present evidence about the piglet, there's no defense that's even possible. And frankly, we got pretty close to that. The judge excluded so much of the evidence in this case that I'd say, I think it was close to 90% of our proposed exhibits were excluded from court. But even hearing the story of these two individual piglets, Lizzie and Lily, the two piglets we saved from Circle 4 Farms, Lynn started to identify with her. He started to think of Lily and Lizzie not the way we think of bacon, but the way he thinks about his dog at home. And there was one point after the trial when I asked him, because the jury did ultimately unanimously acquit us, much to the surprise of everyone, including the prosecutor and the judge. Shortly before the trial, the judge actually pulled our lawyers aside and threatened them and said, look, your client is guilty. I don't see how this is a case that's even a dispute. You can take a plea now. We're going to minimize the amount of damage that's caused. Otherwise, there's a new jail going up right next to this courthouse. Your clients are going there for a long time, right? Even the judge himself was basically, and this is very unethical and unconstitutional. The judge is not supposed to chime in this way and pressure a defendant and pressure the lawyers to take a plea deal. But everyone in the courtroom is just stunned when they acquit us. And when I asked Lynn afterwards, because Lynn and I have struck up a little friendship now. I actually went to visit him in southern Utah just a few weeks ago. When I asked Lynn shortly after the verdict, what was it? What drove you to act in a fashion that's contrary to your prior beliefs, contrary to your own dietary habits, contrary to the pressure of your entire community? And to this day, Lynn says, when I go out golfing, people say like, oh, you were one of the people who was in that pig trial. And they laugh at him, they mock him, they point at him. And what he explained to me and what he explains to all of his golf buddies and all the other conservatives and rural people in southern Utah that he works with and he plays golf with is, I saw this little piglet. I heard Wayne tell me stories about her, and I realized I liked her alive a lot more than I liked her dead. And that is something that's true of almost all of us. When most people see an animal, whether it's in a nature documentary, whether it's an animated film, or whether it's a dog or cat in their own lives, most human beings want to fight for life. They want to fight for consciousness and sentience. They don't want to fight for death and suffering. And that is a huge advantage we have over the industry that we need to harness more and be bolder and more confident about, because even in the most conservative and rural counties of America, we can win if we make that case to the world. And subsequently, Lynn has drafted op-eds on our behalf. He's fought legislation in Utah shortly after this trial. The Utah legislature tried to pass legislation, unfortunately, in the short term, succeeded at passing anti-personhood legislation, because one of the arguments we were making in this courtroom was Lily is not a thing. Lily was a person. And so the Utah legislature literally passed a law saying, in the state of Utah, animals are not persons. Only humans are persons. And by the way, also corporations. Corporations are people too, according to the state of Utah. And Lynn has written op-eds for us. He's joined documentaries. He's helped us with contesting legislation in Utah. He's been such a tremendous ally for the animals. And while he actually stopped eating pork, he's not vegetarian yet. He's considering it, but he's not yet. And it shows us the incredible potential of people we might not see as aligned with our movement perfectly yet to be incredible allies to the animals if we're willing to accept their support. And I'm very glad and honestly honored that Lynn has supported us as much as he has in the years since that verdict. But Lynn's not the only example. There's a half dozen other jurors who, after sitting down with us for a week or two or three, including one of the jurors who convicted me in Sonoma County, who've now joined summits, have come to animal rights events, and become advocates for animals in various ways as a result of their experience. And I think I'll say one last thing about this. One of the things that we need to do to achieve this sort of transformation is convince more people or in some cases, compel more people to engage with the animal rights movement in a more deliberative way. Because most people, if they stay at a very surface level, their compassion is not provoked. Their ethical thinking is not provoked. Most human beings do what all the other humans around them are doing. There's very little reflection about the social norms in which we live because that's who we are as a species. We are a social animal. We engage in practices largely based on what the people around us do. To get beyond that surface layer, we have to find a way to provoke genuine deliberation and reflection in people. I'm very confident if we're able to do that, people will be transformed. And in fact, we're evidence of this because a lot of us, in fact, I would dare say most of us probably were eating animals, didn't understand the atrocities committed against animals at some point in our lives. And at some point, we went through some reflection, some deliberation. And the courtroom is just one setting. And the great thing about a jury is that they're forced to deliberate with us. They don't have a choice. They've been called to the jury service. They're a compelled audience to sit with me for a week and hear me talk about animal rights. I'm very convinced that if we could convince the entire nation or world to engage in that same deliberation, they too would be transformed. So we have to find more ways to compel people to engage in that reflection and deliberation in the same way the juries in Merced County or in Beaver County, Utah, deliberated with us and reached the conclusion that they prefer to see the animals alive to seeing them dead.
Love it. Now we're supposed to stop now, but I asked Phil, and he's given me the ability to ask one more question.
Mhm.
And that is, as I look out in the world today, really unlike any time since I started to be actively concerned for animals over 50 years ago, I'm seeing a response to us that's more hatred and venom
Mm.
rather than just misunderstanding or you guys are crazy or animals don't matter. There's something that's seeming to be a little bit more harsh. I'm wondering if this is something that you see and how we can respond to what's out there right now. And then I promise Phil will stop.
I'll try and be brief and I'll say, I do see it and I think it's an opportunity. I have been to hundreds of demonstrations. I've done outreach thousands of times. From the years 2005 to 2007, 3 years, I did outreach essentially every day for at least a few hours. It's possible I've had more conversations with people about animals than maybe anyone other than a few people like John Camp. I mean, John Camp probably has me beat with his years in vegan outreach, leafleting almost every day. And what I will say is, it is surprising how often the people who are most angry and hateful are also the people who are most ripe for change because they're provoked to anger precisely because they feel judged, they feel ashamed, they feel attacked, they feel they're good people, they feel they're animal lovers. And you're telling them that far from being an animal lover, you are someone who is hurting animals every single day of your life. And for someone who doesn't care about animals, it's like, whatever, I don't care. It doesn't make me mad at all. But I think part of the reason we are seeing this vitriol towards veganism, with the right wing soy boy, rhetoric. I don't know if you've heard this on Twitter, but every complaint about progressives seems to devolve into complaints about soy boys, people who aren't eating meat, who want to take our burgers away. And part of the reason for that is because they see the allegation we're making against the system, not so much the individuals, but the system, as an abusive system towards animals, as something that threatens their own identity. Um, and this is not just me saying this. I mean, there's again extensive sociological literature about the backlash effect. That part of what effective movements do is they provoke a backlash and they harness that backlash for change. And I could say much more about this, but I will say just now, in summary, that yes, there probably is more of a backlash against veganism and animal rights. And no, that is not a bad thing for the movement because if we play our cards correctly, we can transform that backlash, that energy, even with the individuals who are yelling at us. It is shocking how many times when I sit down and actually deliberate with and talk to and listen to someone who's screaming, get a job, or get out of here, soy boy, how often, after a few minutes of conversation, this has happened to me many times, they're literally crying to me and saying, I'm so sorry. I just feel so guilty about what happens to animals. And we have to develop the same tools and skill to transform that energy and anger into compassion.
So beautiful. Thank you so, so very much for taking this time with us today.